What can 160 years of experience teach you about the future? A lot, especially when it comes to protecting what matters. At Pacific Life, we've helped people and businesses confidently embrace the future with life insurance, retirement income, and employee benefits. With strategies built on strength and trust, and a promise to be here for you today and tomorrow. Ask a financial professional how Pacific Life can help you today. Pacific Life Insurance Company, Omaha, Nebraska, and in New York. Pacific Life and Annuity, Phoenix, Arizona.
From 1989 to 1995, nurse Kristen Gilbert murdered 4 of her patients at the Veterans Affairs Medical Center in Massachusetts, and she's suspected of killing dozens more. On Mind of a Monster, a podcast from ID, criminal psychologist Dr. Michelle Ward dives into Kristen Gilbert's twisted mind to try and find out why she killed her patients and how she was able to do it in front of her colleagues. She speaks with detectives, journalists, nurses, and victims' families to unpack Gilbert's life and crimes on Ward C. Listen to Mind of a Monster, The Killer Nurse, wherever you get your podcasts.
I just want to point out, I think it's interesting that the 3 cases that you've had me on for the October episodes involve home invasions. And I think that is because when we think about people coming into our home, this is where we feel safe, or we're supposed to feel safe. And the idea of a killer breaking into your home and coming in and killing you is terrorizing. So it's interesting you picked those cases, and maybe that's what subconsciously terrifies you, is this idea of, when you're in your home, you should be safe.
That's Julia Cowley, a retired FBI profiler and the host of the Consult podcast. This is the Silver Linings Handbook podcast. I'm Jason Blair. Julia Cowley is a retired FBI agent and criminal profiler. Julia is also the host of The Consult, a podcast where retired FBI profilers analyze cases just as they would have in the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit. Julia spent 22 years in the FBI, including positions where she investigated violent crime, civil rights matters, and white-collar crime. Julia makes no bones about the fact that it was true crime that led to her interest in forensic science and law enforcement. Today, as a part of our series of October episodes, Julia and I are going to have the first of 2 discussions on Bryan Kohberger and the 2022 University of Idaho murders. Before joining the FBI, Julia was a special agent and forensic scientist with the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation. She has a bachelor's degree in chemistry from the University of Oregon and a master's degree in forensic science from the George Washington University. At the BAU, Julia was the lead profiler on a number of cases we've talked about together, including the East Area Rapist and original Night Stalker cases that were combined into what's now known as the Golden State Killer case. She worked on the case of serial killer Israel Keyes, the murder of Philip DiMartino, and the Wilitka murders, all of which we've touched upon in prior episodes. I encourage you to go back and listen to those. She's also worked on the early stages of the Long Island serial killer case. On November 13, 2022, at an off-campus house at 1122 King Road in Moscow, Idaho, 4 victims, 21-year-old Madison Mogan, 21-year-old Kaylee Goncalves, 20-year-old Zana Kronoodle, and 20-year-old Ethan Chapin, were stabbed to death in the early morning hours. The attack was brutal, swift, and left little forensic evidence other than a knife sheath found near one of the victims. It would take time to eventually link the case to Bryan Kohberger, a 28-year-old PhD student at the nearby Washington State University. The case stunned the small college town, which I had a chance to visit in 2023. It drew national attention The police received thousands of tips and scrutinized surveillance footage. We would later find out that a white Hyundai Elantra seen near the crime scene would become a key lead. DNA evidence found on the knife sheath was eventually matched to Kohberger. He was a student in criminology at the nearby university. His cell phone data showed that he had been by the house several times before the murders, and that the same phone went off the grid in between his apartment in Pullman, Washington, and Moscow, and reappeared on a highway south of Moscow hours later. Kohberger was arrested on December 30th of that year at his home in Pennsylvania and was charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of felony burglary. He was indicted in May 2023 and pled guilty to all the charges to avoid the death penalty on July 2nd of this year. He received 4 consecutive life sentences without parole, plus 10 years for the burglary. But for many people, questions remain about his motive, which remains a mystery. His methods, where the murder weapon is, his mental state, and his motivations. Today, we're going to discuss all of that and more. So, Julia, I just wanted to thank you coming on for the umpteenth time. I think this is the 3rd October where we've done an episode on some real life nightmare. The first one was Israel Keys. The second one was Joe D'Angelo. Both cases that you worked and that are fascinating. And I think that there are a lot of myths around them. So I enjoyed doing both of these episodes. I appreciate you coming on to talk about this case. And I just generally appreciate your insight and wisdom when it comes to understanding behaviors that are behind crimes.
Thank you for having me again. It's going to be a pattern. How about change the word? Tradition.
Tradition. Yes. It was really funny. So as I was preparing for the episodes, I was like, I'm going to go back and see how many episodes we've done together. And I just kept looking and I'm like, I am never going to scroll through this whole thing and figure out how many there totally are. So, there's plenty of, I think, great conversations that we've had, really starting with the first conversation that we ever had about your career as a profiler. And I still get comments about that episode from people who are interested in going into, forensic science or criminal profiling or working in the FBI. And so, yeah, I'm glad we met and I'm glad we did that.
Yeah.
I guess I wanted to start off today. I remember back in sort of the end of 2022 when I first heard about the University of Idaho killings, and we had scant facts in the beginning. We just knew 4 college students had been murdered. It seemed to me particularly frightening on some level. I think I was taken aback by the fact that, in the middle of the night or the early morning hours, 4 college students were killed. And it's not normal, right? It's not the normal quadruple homicide. Usually when I hear about 4 people being killed, it's in a city or at some rowdy party that people are having, or it's drug related, or it's a mass shooting. It wasn't a shooting, right? 4 were sort of stabbed to death, and that kind of seemed different for a quadruple homicide. And I think it was also affected by the fact, and I don't know whether I was just sort of being reminiscent or it was the fact that, the kids are getting older. But, I thought back to college and what college was like for me, and that it was this time of sort of exploration and growth, and there were all these opportunities, and something about 4, I think, college students ending up killed really sort of captured me. And I wanted to sort of just ask you about what your initial reaction was when you heard about the crime.
I just want to point out, I think it's interesting that the 3 cases that you've had me on for the October episodes involve home invasions.
Oh, yeah. That's actually
And
a really good
I
point.
think that is because when we think about people coming into our home, this is where we feel safe, or we're supposed to feel safe. And the idea of a killer breaking into your home and coming in and killing you is terrorizing. So it's interesting you pick those cases, and maybe that's what subconsciously terrifies you, is this idea of, when you're in your home, you should be safe.
It's interesting you say that. I never think about this piece, but I remember when I first started listening to uh, podcasts about Israel Keys. And there are not a lot of cases that will like rattle me, you know. But that one did. And I think what rattled me about Keys, well, I don't want to say it. What I found interesting about Keys was it's not every day that you have a killer who's going to kill kids across the country and commit murders so far from where they live. So that was odd and kind of interesting to me. But actually, I think what rattled me about him was exactly that, because it's probably the only true crime case that I can think of, at least as an adult, where I had nightmares about it. And I remember waking up in my nightmares. So not really waking up, but like literally in the nightmare, being asleep and waking up and feeling like he was at my door or at my window, or somebody was. And I wonder whether for me, like you said, that there's something about like in the middle of the night, or invading your space or your home, or somebody hiding in your house.
Yeah. I think we think that's where we should be at our lowest risk.
Yep.
And most people are. So the idea that someone can come in and violate us in our homes is really the ultimate terror, the boogeyman coming in. And that's why we find these cases so difficult to understand
Yeah.
and believe. And when you see victims who are just in their homes doing nothing, and they're not out and about, maybe doing something that would increase their risk. I mean, just walking outside your home, you increase your risk a little bit. And, the idea that they are not doing anything wrong and someone can come in, that makes us all feel vulnerable
Yeah.
in a way. So, I remember thinking, I mean, I got a lot of messages from people like, what do you think? What do you think? And it's like, I really don't know. I don't know. We don't know enough information at all about what the circumstances are, who the victims are. I mean, we had so little information when it first happened. So that my first thought was just, I don't know. And that's really with most cases when I first hear, I think people want to ask you and they want an answer like, why do you think this happened? Or what's going on? And usually I'm just like, I don't know, or at the least risk, mostly, unless you're in a violent relationship or something. But I think that was part of it. And you also had these college students, and we can all relate to them in some capacity, whether
Right.
we're the same age as them, whether we have children, uh, just whether we live near them in that kind of or similar community. I think everyone could somehow find a connection to the 4 victims. And
I remember thinking to myself too, you know, why would someone kill 4 students? And it just, I mean, people do get killed on college campuses. It happens. Um, you know, Often it's because of some personal thing, or it's a rape that's gone and turned into a murder or something along those lines. But something about 4 people too being killed in the same place really struck me. And I remember thinking to myself, like, why would anyone do this other than someone like a serial killer in my mind? And I guess I just had for some reason, not that we're going to know a motive very early, but it just didn't fit any of the molds that sort of stuck in my head for a case like this. And, I think one of the things that really stuck out for me, 4 people being killed in a college house, which reminds me of like Ted Bundy.
I was just going to say that was the first thing. Well, maybe, yeah. It was one of the first things that I thought, just kind of reminiscent of Ted Bundy's crimes.
Yeah. And what was it? The Chi Omega house where he went in and did that attack that, killed multiple girls. And I think he injured some that survived in that one attack. And, I also thought about Bundy in the sense that it's the kind of like messy kind of crime that he did toward the end, and thought about the audacity that it takes to try and invade a house with multiple people to kill people. But, it left me with that sort of like serial killer vibe, that serial killer feeling. And if ultimately we had found out months later that there was actually a serial killer that had been building up to a crime like this, like they had done other violent crimes or killed some individual, and that it sort of led to this, I think that wouldn't have surprised me at all. But instead, in December, when there was the arrest, we essentially got somebody who had saved traffic tickets, and, he got charged because he stole his sister's phone to sell it for drugs and drug addiction. We had somebody who really didn't have a criminal history. Somebody who, if he was sort of the mold of a serial killer, went really big on the first move. Because if this is his idea of like starting early, that was a pretty, big way, bold way. And I understand that maybe I'm assuming that he intended to kill 4 people. Maybe he didn't. Maybe he intended to kill 1 person. But I was really sort of taken aback by the fact that the person who was arrested, I don't think it surprised me he was a criminology student, but it really surprised me that he didn't have this prior record of violence.
Mm-hmm. I think, going back to your first impression, thinking, oh, this reminds me of a serial killer, possibly. And I think that was my first thought, too. And I immediately thought of Ted Bundy like you. But then the rational, logical side of me said, okay, serial killing is very rare. So, and this, of course, without knowing any details at all. So my logical side kicks in, the stats, and serial killing is a very rare occurrence. It's unlikely to be a serial killer. Victimology is going to be really important in this case. And those were where my thoughts were going investigatively. And, then, obviously it played out. And then you have this guy who seemingly doesn't fit what you would think because he doesn't have a violent history, as we would have expected. Or I think that a lot of people would have expected. And, the history that I would be looking for, and it wouldn't necessarily be a violent criminal history, but I would be looking for a history of burglary, things like that, because you do have a home invasion.
And what's the reason for burglary? Is the idea there that you're crossing a certain kind of barrier when you're willing to go into someone's home?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you don't necessarily, we don't see it often. We see a lot of serial killers that do go into homes. They do have a history of burglary. So there's that escalation. So burglary is where they start. So I would suggest that you're not necessarily looking for someone who's murdered before or has a sexual assault history, but you might be looking for somebody that has a history of burglary, because what we do see here is someone entering a home and to commit a crime. And so that would be sort of my first investigative thoughts and behavior. So I would expect this offender not necessarily to have the violent history that we would expect, but maybe this history of burglary, and not only burglary, but what leads up to burglary, trespassing, loitering, peeping, those types of things. That would also be in the history of this person. Now, it may not be in their criminal history, but these would be behaviors I would expect out of someone who goes in and commits this type of crime.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's always hard to, I think, in a high profile crime, because in retrospect, you get a lot of people saying a lot of different things about what a person may or may not have done.
Yeah.
But
But I have the benefit of having said all this before in other cases. So it's kind of like, it maybe didn't say it about this specific case, but it's other cases where we've seen homicides, where someone goes into the home. We've said these very similar things and they've turned out to be accurate. And so it's not really like, obviously we now know who did it. So, but I can honestly say that this is something I would say whether they identify the offender or not in this case.
right, because Joe D'Angelo, Golden State Killer, who was both the East Area rapist and the original Night Stalker, he had sort of like an escalating pattern of his burglaries that eventually led to the rapes that eventually, I'm guessing in his case, for very utility type reasons, then
Yeah.
resulted in murder.
Yeah, and I will say, like, looking at his case, I mean, a lot of people didn't believe the Visalia ransacker was the East Area rapist because there seemed to be such an escalation. While he didn't murder his first victims, there was an escalation from just burglary to sexual assault of multiple victims. And that seemed to be such an escalation that it was hard for some to connect it. So even though we're looking at Bryan Kohberger and we see this huge escalation, he just goes right in and commits murder. And it's the first time he's ever done it. That's typical. People think, oh, he escalated to that, but it's not so much out of. It would not be a surprise if we probably were able to see, what he was thinking, what he was looking at, what he was fantasizing about, how long that was going on, all the things he may have done that he was never caught for. I mean, all of those things we may never know.
Right.
But I would be surprised if none of those elements were part of his history.
That we were going to find some of that somewhere, some of that loitering around someone's house, or maybe even. Would it surprise you, because there's no evidence of this, at least publicly, but like in a case like this, would it surprise you if someone like him had entered the house already on another night and done nothing and then came back, that kind of thing?
No, that wouldn't surprise me.
Not at all.
Yeah, I know there's no evidence of that, but it wouldn't surprise me. It wouldn't be unheard of if he did do that. Why? If that could be part of the planning process.
Yeah.
I mean, we know he was in the area on multiple occasions, at the very least. So did he actually go into the house? I don't know, but I wouldn't be surprised if he did. And I actually wouldn't be surprised if he didn't.
Yep. Yeah. Well, what got me thinking about it was exactly what you're getting at, which is the cell phone records and the thought that he made, more than a dozen trips in that area, a high number of trips in that area. Now, some of those could have been for other reasons, because having been there, everything's really compact. There are a lot of different things from the University of Idaho that are near there, and downtown Moscow. It's really relatively close, but they know a lot of them are really, really close to that King Road property. And I wonder, what made me think about it was they're the cell phone records, and then also the white Elantra on camera circling around and around and around to park before the killer gets out. And having been there, it takes a lot of effort. Just the way the parking lots are and how narrow the road is, it would take a lot of effort to circle around. And I just thought, is this guy like building up through this whole sequence of things? And the white Elantra spinning around is just the last stage of his building up. And in a weird way, in retrospect, while I saw probably a lot of boldness in the beginning, the scary kind of boldness when I didn't know much about the case, the more I found out about the case and his behavior, the more I sort of picked up on insecurity, if that makes sense.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's definitely an element to his personality, I think. He had, significant issues growing up that he I guess, overcame, which would be, he had his weight loss surgery, so his obesity, his drug addictions. So, clearly there's some underlying issues there for him and reasons for that, particularly the drug abuse. Why that? And then he overcomes all this and maybe thinks, now I'll be accepted. But I do think that, we talk about this so much on our show. We talked about it in the Kohberger case, and we've got a couple follow-up episodes that are going to be coming out now that more information has been released. But we just talk about the compensatory nature of the crimes and why he may have committed them.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting you gave that example. So in mental health, a really common scenario that you'll see when people want to get gastric bypass surgery, they have to go in, usually in most places, for a mental health evaluation. It's usually done by a doctor or a psychiatrist. I may be wrong here, but I think in some states, psychologists can be a part of the evaluating team. But, you're looking for all sorts of things. And one of the things that you're looking for, and people have learned over time to lie about this, one of the things you're looking for is you want to make sure the person doesn't think all their problems in the world will be solved by this thing that they're doing. To know that it's going to be hard work, because, and I don't even mean like their weight loss problems. You get a lot of people who think everything in their life will be solved by doing this, that it will all cascade. And those people, when I've seen them on the other end, where they've come out of the gastric bypass surgery and they did have that kind of thinking, they ended up often being even more miserable in some ways because this thing that they thought was a silver bullet. And that really reminded me of him. Like, he got fit, he lost weight, he went and got his master's, but still,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's not just about not having willpower or not being able or being hungry. It may curb your appetite. It may make it so you can't eat as much, but it doesn't solve why you were overeating or whatever behavior it is that you're doing that's not healthy that you use to cope.
Mm-hmm.
And you really have to treat that, I believe, before you can't, a lot of people eat. I remember this, we had this big tree. This is a long, long time ago. My kids were babies and my mom was visiting, and a tree fell on our neighbor's house, and it was like lightning, and it was a big, boom, and it sounded like an explosion. And we go outside. It was all just like neighbors were out, and we go back inside, and my mom's like, "Oh, that's so exciting. I got to eat something." And, that people eat not necessarily because they're hungry, because they have emotions, whether they
that are interconnected to it.
Yeah, bored, excitement, all sorts of things that are not even just about like just hunger and, nourishment. But I'll never forget that, because I'm like, that's how I am too. It's like,
blew up.
Yeah, like, oh, this was so much excitement. I need to have like a treat now or something, and maybe some people can relate to that or not, but I can certainly. But it just goes to show it's not necessarily about, the bad behavior or just stopping it or curbing an appetite for drugs or food or whatever. It's really like, why are you doing that?
In the original part, if you don't really look at the core reason. So when you guys talk about something being compensatory in nature, what are you looking at and looking for?
Well, usually we're just looking for, I think generally, like, why is this person feeling the need that they have to go in and kill 4 innocent people? I mean, just using this case as the example, since that's what the case we're talking about. It's rarely, and I don't say never, but I'm just trying to think. I know I was asking Bob at one point. I'm trying to think of a true case where somebody wasn't acting out of, insecurity, some form of it. I think we came up with a couple. We should probably cover them on the show. But like, why? Why are you doing that? Why do you feel like you need to go control and take a life or something? And to me, that means that there's something missing. There is something, some void. And that's really sounds very like I'm minimizing things, but there really is some void there and some need and some feeling they're trying to get that they can't otherwise get through normal, healthy channels. And a lot of times, those feelings get intertwined with violent fantasies. And so he's compensating. So in real life, he may feel like he's ineffective. This makes him feel like he's effective. He may feel like he doesn't have any power. This makes him feel powerful. He may not feel that he's masculine. This makes him feel macho. So that's what we mean by compensatory, because going and taking someone's life does give you the ultimate control. And if you have violent fantasies, then that's where you turn to.
Yeah. And I was thinking, as you were saying, I was sort of scrolling through my head, like the vast majority of murders I know about have some element of control involved in it. Like even a drug shooting usually there's like you're trying to get something or gain control over something. Domestic violence, we see it all the time. In those situations, there's a strong element of control. And I was trying to think of in my head, like, try and think of a murder that I could not tie to control. And I came up with one or two, but so many of them are about grabbing control in some way.
Yeah, I feel like almost all of them, but I know that that's not the case. I just can't think. I'm too tired to think off the top of my head. I probably should have prepared. Like, and maybe we should do some on our show that covers something a little bit different than the other cases that we've covered. Because a lot of the cases, the serial cases that we've worked on, really, there's a lot of, it's about control and it's about compensation.
Yeah.
I think most of them are control, though, whether it's for compensation or not,
or for another reason, right?
Yeah.
Like it really does come down to some element of control, because if you're going to take such a dramatic, rash, permanent act, you need to there's got to be a decent incentive for you. Something, and that's usually going to be something that you're managing or need or some element of that. One of the things that I was kind of thinking about in the context of that, I'm sure I've told you this story before, or my listeners have heard it, but I have the story of a police detective who once tells me that the holy trinity of murder, and as he did it, he drew a little cross. It's like the holy trinity of murder: drugs, money, relationships. And he said that if we're investigating a murder and the motive is not drugs, relationships, or money, it's a whodunit. And he said whodunits are the worst kinds of cases. And I imagine the BAU gets a lot of cases that appear to be whodunits. But one of the things about it that I've always felt that sort of like, for me personally, and maybe this is my own sense of sort of like control and understanding the world. Well, I know exactly where it comes from. An important sort of like driver for me is for the world to make sense. Now, even if to the average person it makes no logical sense, if I can sort of like psychologically understand how the pieces go together and why certain things happen, I feel better. So this may be me projecting here, but to some extent. But whodunits sort of really, really, really sort of like frighten me a little bit more than anything I can link to something. And I think there probably is some truth, because I see this in the true crime community where people are just so bloody focused on motive. But I was just curious for you, whether you agree that there's something sort of more disturbing about motives that exist outside of that space. And any idea why it gets under our skin? Or
Yeah, and I do like that. I like the idea of what he says, the Holy Trinity. For me, the Holy Trinity is personal cause homicide, sexually motivated homicide, or financially motivated. Like those are kind of what I'm looking for. And of course, personal cause homicide fits a lot of what he's talking about, like relationships, and that financial could be in there as well. But usually personal cause homicide means somebody, has a grievance with somebody, or it's anger, revenge, killing somebody who's an obstacle to a goal or something like that. So those are sort of the ways I categorize motive. I think where the problem comes, like for me, I'm usually at peace with motive. I don't continue to be like, why? I don't. I usually, if I can get the motive into one of those, my Holy Trinity
buckets
category, then I'm okay. I think where people struggle with motive is that they're looking at it from the victim's perspective as opposed to the offender's perspective. So with me, when I look at Bryan Kohberger, I think it's likely a sexually motivated homicide. Done. Motive. But when I tell people that, they're like, yeah, but why did he do it? And
you're asking a deeper why than anyone's going to get an answer to.
Yeah. And it's like nobody can, people just say, why? What's the motive? That's because they continue to focus on the victim. I'm not saying they're victim blaming at all, but they're looking at it from the victim's perspective as opposed to offender perspective. And that's why we have trouble really getting to motive. But when I assign this is sexually motivated, I'm good. I'm done. I don't, I feel like I know why. I know why Bryan Kohberger did what he did. Now, why did he pick the specific victims? That's a whole other question about how he identified his victims, but he did. And there doesn't seem to be any investigative information that conclusively shows how he came across the victims that he chose. We don't know. But I'm okay with all that. And I think I'm at peace knowing I don't feel like I necessarily need to know more or need a better understanding. I feel like I understand it fairly well, if that makes sense.
No, it does. It's interesting because you said looking at it from the victim's perspective, and I was just thinking about how I think it's helpful or cathartic sometimes for people to understand why a victim was selected, for example, just taking it from that perspective. And I don't think people are victim blaming, but I think we kind of use it as a template. Like we've all heard this story. Oh, this person got assaulted or something happened. They were attacked on the trail. Oh, well, they were out at 10 p.m. And so like now in your head, you're like, don't go out on the trail at 10 p.m. You feel better, right? So I think for a lot of people, not knowing how the victims were selected, why they were selected, like what they're really getting at to some extent is how do we keep myself and other people safe?
Right. Yeah. And I think, and then in this particular case, we talk about the victim selection process all the time, availability, vulnerability, and desirability. And that's what the offender's going through. And to really understand, only the offender can really understand. But that's his process.
Right.
And how he determined that, and we can speculate too if who was the ultimate victim or the number one victim. But how he determined that, we may never know. Like, where did he first see? He saw one of the victims at some point, somewhere, at some time. Was it just from driving around the neighborhood because he had picked that neighborhood? Or was it because he saw her somewhere else and followed her? Was it because, we just don't know. We don't have the evidence to say. And I think people do want to know how come she was selected, or, multiple victims selected. Why was that house selected? All of that, why, what made him think that that house was a good location to commit this crime?
Mm-hmm.
Or was the victim so much desire that he was willing to, go over any obstacle
to get there?
We don't know. Like with Joe D'Angelo, he tended, I don't always see I don't even want to say he tended to. He stuck to the same neighborhoods. They all looked the same. He had his hunting grounds. He really did not vary from the type of neighborhood. So that was really key to him. He needed to be comfortable in the type of dwelling he would enter. And then I think he chose his victims, chose his hunting grounds first. So we don't know Bryan Kohberger's his selection process. Maybe someday he'll explain it. But it's something. It's going to fit something. Was it that he saw the house, he see the victim? I tend to think he probably saw a victim and decided, that house looks like one I'm comfortable, entering. He may have maybe he saw another victim and he didn't like the layout of the house, or, it wasn't conducive. Maybe it was, too many dwellings, or, we just don't know. But
or the random things that I think about, if we're going to believe Israel Keys, which I don't really believe anything or much of what he says, but I remember him saying at one point that, when he, and I know I'm giving into a little bit of his myth here, but, when he had a potential victim who would start talking to him and they would become more like a human to him, he'd lose his interest. And I just think that it's a bit like an assortment of different things. I think murder, suicide, an assortment of different things. Sometimes just understanding the why, even if you did understand it, it still wouldn't make sense to you. I remember because I've talked to a lot of people after they've made a suicide attempt or not made a suicide attempt, and talked to them about like why they decided not to, or what went wrong. And I remember one guy saying to me, who then later successfully committed suicide, but after the suicide attempt, I asked him, why'd you decide not to go through with it? And he said that he had decided in his mind as he was sitting in the bathtub that if his work called, didn't matter if his wife called or anyone else, if his work called, he wouldn't commit suicide. It was just random. It was just that kind of like random thing. So I think some element of the why, you mentioned the part how like once you know it's a sexually motivated homicide, good enough for you, and people want to know a little bit more of the why. But I think there's some element of the why that would be nonsensical to us. Is that?
Yeah. And I think that's why I can sort of let it go, is because we're never really going to know. And even if we did know it, we'd just still be like, why?
Right. Yes.
Yeah.
Because just like with that guy I was talking to you about, when he said he was waiting for the call from work, my follow-up question was, why work? And he didn't really know.
Yeah. I mean, sometimes sometimes we all don't have great insight into some things, why we tell ourselves certain things or why we do something a certain way. We may not know, well, why did you do that? I don't know. I don't know why. I just always did it that way. And I think there's an element with Bryan Kohberger too, where he's very regimented. So, he may have fixated and wasn't really going to weigh, I don't want to say the consequences, but how hard something was going to be to do. It's just like, I've set this into my mind. This is what I'm going to do. And it really wasn't as much of a process as maybe we might think, in selection of that particular victim or particular house. I mean, it might have just been, this is who I'm choosing, and I'm not really great at altering things or thinking things through as carefully as I should. And that's why I'm going to, not waver. And, you see that in a sense in his crimes when, things were going wrong. You probably should have got out of there.
Yeah.
And he was debating, time was running out for if he wanted to get out before daylight, it was getting later. And it was almost like he had made up his mind he wasn't going to deviate from that and use rational thought process, or like, maybe I shouldn't do this.
Like he was locked into his mind.
Very locked in. And you see that you do see this focus and this locked in. We see that with child sex offenders who offender going to meet an underage victim, and usually it's a setup by law enforcement. They are so fixated. They don't notice law enforcement following them. They don't notice any things that might be warning signs to them. They're just so focused on committing this crime that they don't notice things. And my one of my colleagues who worked these types of cases used to call it white knuckles. He's like, don't worry how close you are to him. He'll never see you because they're all white knuckles.
It's total tunnel vision, right? It's
Yes.
complete tunnel vision.
Yeah. So
Don't
anyway,
worry about how close you are. I like that one.
Yeah, it was on surveillance, and I was a newer agent. He's like, "Don't worry about it." Like I was like, I don't want to get burned." He's like, "You're not going to get burned. These guys, they white knuckle. They just all there's driving, and it's so set that they don't see law enforcement. And I found that to be pretty consistent.
That's
And
interesting.
Yeah, it is interesting. I mean, I can't say that with 100% certainty, but I will say in my experience, these offenders are not aware of their surroundings, and they're pretty much set on what they plan to do. And that could have been Kohberger as well.
Yeah, one of the things that has often been said about it, the case that I think that I think is kind of interesting, people have often said, like, he made one mistake. And, the one mistake was leaving the knife sheath, and that had his DNA on it. And I'm curious what you think, but when I look at the crime itself, going all the way back to like visiting the location multiple times with your cell phone, turning off your cell phone after you've left your home, having it go dark during the murders, and then it popping up live again in some area not near your home. Like I view that as a mistake. And then when I look at the crime itself and the, different likely sequences of events and how messy it was and how random it was and how he walked right by a victim. And, I also wonder whether he was surprised in the beginning that two girls, I just see a mess of a crime, actually, to me.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like the only thing that went right was he killed someone. Like everything else just feels very messy. And he got out before the police.
Yeah, I think he made one mistake that identified him.
Yeah.
But once he's identified, then all of these things, some of it which he thought were, trying to cover his tracks, actually identified him even more. Was used as evidence against him, because once he's identified and you see things that become a little more difficult to explain, like he turns off his phone during the time the crimes are committed, he's been in the area. I mean, all these things are then used against him. So I think the one mistake is that he was identified. That's all I would say. But there were numerous mistakes, as you pointed out. I think it was very sloppy. Ultimately, now, I know there's been some debate about whether if he had not dropped the sheath or not, would he have still been identified? I don't know. I think maybe would have taken longer. I think maybe they might have been able to identify him. Would they have been able to bring charges against him? I'm not certain about that. I just don't. I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm doubtful, but because you had his DNA, and then because you had all these things that he had done, as you pointed out, then he, it was a lot of evidence against him, and it was not a very well executed crime at all. Although I think he thought he was being smart.
It feels like a really, how can I put it, a well-planned but poorly executed crime. Or not well-planned, but it felt like there was some planning that involved, like the shutting off the cell phone and taking all these. He got rid of the weapon successfully, cleaned the car, did all these other things. So I have to guess, given how regimented he was, that those ideas did not come off the cuff. A lot of that wasn't off the cuff. But to your point, I think it wasn't well executed, and it also wasn't planned well enough. I mean, and it's kind of interesting he was a criminology PhD, because it felt very academic to me. Like, you pulled out the academic textbook and you forgot the part where people said, like, oh, the enemy gets a vote in the war, and there are going to be surprises. There are always going to be surprises, and be prepared for surprises. And, I kind of look at the whole thing, and I really wonder whether he, going back to that idea of control, whether he even got what he wanted out of the crime, whether he was even successful. I mean, do you get any ideas, like, from your end, sexually motivated crime? Did he just want to murder someone and get away with it? Was this academic exercise?
I mean, I think
Final
he thought,
project?
yeah, I mean, you've thrown a lot at me here. Well, first of all, I'm going to say, did he get what he wanted? Yeah, I think he went in and intended to murder somebody. I do not think he entered into that house to commit a sexual assault.
Okay.
That does not mean I don't think that this was a sexually motivated homicide, but I don't think he intended to sexually assault anybody. He intended to murder.
Meaning the idea he had a sexual motive, but that doesn't always result in sexual assault.
Yeah. I think there's a lot that suggests to me the burglary aspect, the stalking, the leading up to it. And I go back to what Dennis Rader said about stalking his victims. He said that was almost better than the murder. I think, in fact, I think he said he enjoyed that process more than he enjoyed the murder itself. So, and again, this goes to why I think it's a sexually motivated homicide. You don't have to have the overt sexual component to it for it to be sexually motivated. So I think all the stuff you talk about, the planning, the forensics, all of that was really titillating to him. And the whole process was probably extremely gratifying to him, maybe even more so than the murder himself. So I do think he got out of it what he intended to get out of it. And you see that from his bathroom selfie. Thumbs up.
Thumbs up. So happy.
I don't know I don't know really how you interpret that any other way than I did it. It's shortly after the murder. I think he found it fairly gratifying and was happy with it. Was it everything he thought it would be? No, maybe not. Maybe he felt empowered because he ran into some obstacles that he wasn't expecting, and he felt he successfully navigated those obstacles. So maybe that made him feel even more powerful than had he just gone in and killed one person. Because I do think some things that, went awry for him, and which ultimately did lead to his identification, because I think he dropped the sheath in the melee. And had that not happened, he wouldn't have dropped the sheath. So things didn't go right, but ultimately I think he probably felt pretty good about the whole thing. There was something else you had brought up too. You had a lot packed into your question.
The academic exercise part of it, and just wanting to, is it that he just wanted to get away with a murder or commit a murder?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. I just think, I don't think that was the ultimate thing. I think he thought he was going to be able to, because I think he thought he was smarter than everybody. So, yeah, I mean, I think he thought, because he studied it and he was definitely forensically aware, and that was his focus. I mean, he focused on the forensics, and I think he thought he was smarter than law enforcement, and like he could get away with it. And this goes to what I think was some arrogance on his part, that because he was smarter, because he had studied it, he could get away with it. But what really comes down to is that, unless you do the job, you really don't understand it. And it's clear he did not really understand it.
Right.
And I don't think I think part of it was the unknown as well. The fact that things didn't quite go according to plan, and he probably had to kill more people than maybe he intended to, or he had confrontations he didn't expect. And that just comes from, I mean, I don't know how I would describe it, but just, stupidity, really. Like, how can you, none of that was planned for.
Right.
Because almost like, there was no plan for things to go wrong. And I don't think he thought that part through. I think he thought everything leading up to it, and then afterwards is how I'm going to get rid of the weapon, all of this. But he really didn't think about what was going to happen when I actually interact with other human beings. And I think that was his downfall. He does not know how to interact with human beings, and he couldn't think about what might happen.
He couldn't anticipate it. And you see a lot of that in his actual background. I remember reading about basically, essentially, like, he had one good friend. It was a woman who I think eventually died of a heroin overdose, who was a peer, but he had really hard time connecting with other people because of a lot of those social cues and other things. And I was thinking about the point that you're making about him being so regimented and sort of like contrasting that to like the way, you know, the military or SWAT team plans, like, you have your plan, you have your backup plan, you have your plan for if these four things happen, we're going to abort. And if we abort, this is what we're going to do. If the offender, whoever does X, Y, or Z, we're going to get out of here. And it seems like he really, like you said, he just plowed.
Yeah, because he has no experience.
Yeah.
He has the academic knowledge. That's all well and good, but when you really don't have any experience in it, and when you really don't quite understand how investigations go, and then you don't have a good understanding of human behavior because you're not capable, or you just lack the ability to really interact with other people and understand human behavior. I think those were his downfalls. But you're absolutely right. Even if it wasn't a SWAT arrest and we were just doing an arrest, if I'm going to arrest somebody, we have to do what we call op orders. And at the back, there's a page of contingencies. Like, well, if this happens, then this. And it's like 20 of them, and you always hope, and you always hope that you never have to use those, but they're always in place. And that's the first thing when something goes wrong on an arrest. Let's say shots are fired or somebody's killed or, something terrible happens. The first thing that the FBI's inspection team is going to go do is look at all your contingencies. Like, did you, if this happened, it was, did you have a plan for that? And that's, you're right. Like SWAT team, they're always training and, different scenarios, prepared for anything. And that's what he lacked. And ultimately, the main piece of evidence he dropped.
Right. And I think some people, you think of, I think some of it too may be related to this idea that I think can happen, when you're studying something like criminology, it's more like sociology. You're studying the sociology of crime, essentially. You're not really studying how to commit crimes or how people commit crimes. And you're looking, and I guess the point I'm getting at is you're really looking at these things at a 50,000 foot view. You're probably paying attention to successfully committed crimes, not all the ones that went wrong. You're not building that experience. There's no team of serial killers to teach you how to be a good killer. But I wanted to ask you, do you think that and maybe you can't predict this, but do you think that there's a likelihood that he would have killed again if he had gotten away, if he had not been caught?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, that was our ultimate conclusion. And we talked about how rare that is for us to say something like that. But it has all the hallmarks of a serial killing in that the stalking and the planning and the home invasion and all of that. So yes, we do think he would have potentially killed again. I guess we can't say it with 100% certainty, but yeah.
That he had invested so much into the effort that's a sign that this is not. And so in some ways they may have very well stopped more than.
I believe they did. And we weren't saying, in fact, we thought it very potentially, when he moved somewhere else at some point and things cooled down and all, but yes.
And he was no longer getting whatever kick or boost or high out of what had previously happened. Because I was thinking about in the context of, as there's more sort of like better DNA technology, we're finding out that there are all these one-off murders.
Yes.
Where people just kill someone. Thanks for joining me for this first of two conversations with Julia on Bryan Kohberger and the 2022 University of Idaho murders. In the meantime, before our second episode comes out, if you'd like to join us for more discussions with me and other listeners, we can be found on most social media platforms including a listener-run Facebook group called the Silver Linings Fireside Chat. For deeper conversations with our guests and live conversations with other listeners, you can also join us on our Patreon at www.patreon.com/The Silver Linings Handbook. I'm Jason Blair, and this is the Silver Linings Handbook podcast. We'll see you guys all again soon.
You know how everything's a subscription now? Music, movies, even socks. I swear if
To continue this ad, please upgrade to Premium Plus Platinum.
What? No, anyway, Blue Apron...
This is a pay-per-listen ad. Please confirm your billing.
Oh, that's annoying. At least with the new Blue Apron, there's no subscription needed. Get delicious meals delivered without the weekly plan.
Wait, no subscription?
Keep the flavor. Ditch the subscription. Get 20% off your first 2 orders with code APRON20. Terms and conditions apply. Visit blueapron.com/terms for more.